All right, so let's get going on today's meeting. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be beginning our look at memory. So up until now, we've spent a lot of time on vision, and we just finished up with imagery and how things are represented in our mind. And now we're going to go and start taking a look at memory and how memory operates and some of the intricacies of that in our mind. And we're going to begin with a look at some of the structures that are proposed to be in memory and what are the implications of those for our cognitive abilities, for our behaviors, and our thoughts. So, one thing that I'll just mention right at the outset, there we go. One thing that I'll mention right at the outset is that memory is something that is and works probably very different than what you intuitively think that it does. So for the longest time, memory was thought of as a filing system. So the metaphor for memory was that your memory somehow worked as a system of files, and you would have a memory and you would store it somewhere in your mind. And then when you wanted to remember something, you would go and you would retrieve that file. And what they have found in the last couple of decades is that memory is not like a filing system, but memory is actually reconstructive, and your memories are in pieces all over your mind when they're stored. And then when you recall those memories, you bring them back and reconstruct them, literally put them back together again. And that leads to certain complications that can occur with memories, such as false memories when things are put together incorrectly. And it also makes memories, when they're being remembered, very, very vulnerable to recontextualization and remembering. So just a kind of preview, foreshadowing that there are a lot of things that go on in our memory that wouldn't seem intuitive in terms of how you would want to build a memory system. But again, it's not what we wish our mind was like, it's what our mind actually is like. So the human mind reconstructs memory every single time you remember something, reconstructs it out of little pieces that it kept in various areas of your mind. And when it does that, it can include errors, and it also makes it very vulnerable when it's in that reconstructive state. All right, so that was just a little preview, but what are we going to take a look at today? So just a quick little recap to kind of lead us into memory, and we'll go over those examples of extreme memory from the last time we met. And then we're going to take a look at the model of memory, and specifically the idea that we have short-term memory, we have working memory, and we have long-term memory. And then this is going to lead us into a brief discussion of the problem with definitions. So we've encountered one of these discussions previously when we were talking about pictures, so we'll see it again here. And then we'll turn our attention to memory structure, and we will take a look at CogLab number 7, which covered the suffix effect. And then we'll talk about some of the types of long-term memory, specifically explicit memory versus implicit memory. And then we'll take a look at the implicit learning CogLab number 6. All right, so some examples of extreme memory. So this takes us back to our look at imagery representations, where we found the good and the bad level, or the level where our memory for what we have just seen is way below what we intuitively feel it is, are things like change blindness. And then examples of memory that go way beyond what we think is possible are things like photographic memory. And we saw that with Stephen Wiltshire, where it seems that his memory, his ability to store detail, is an imagery representation that preserves details the way that a high resolution photograph would. So change blindness lets us know that we preserve details the way that a low resolution photograph would. But Stephen Wiltshire apparently is dealing with a higher resolution photographic memory. And the only way that he can achieve the things that he does achieve, the most plausible way that he can achieve what he is able to achieve, is with an imagery representation that is extremely detailed and just goes way beyond what we typically consider to be typical memory performance. All right, so what is memory? What's the working definition that we're going to go with? Well, memory is the processes that are involved in using information after that information is no longer present. So it's using information, processing information when that information is no longer in the environment, that you can access that information in real time. So whatever info you are using currently to process and do cognition, that information is no longer present in your environment for you to directly access. So that kind of intuitively fits with what we believe memory to be. So let's keep that in mind as we turn to the modal model of memory. So this is a little bit of a tongue twister, but the modal model of memory is the idea that we have different modalities of memory. We have these separate entities of memory that split our memory ability into distinct functions and distinct entities. So it's not just that memory is an all-encompassing single ability, it's that it is modular in the sense that there's a lot of pieces that make up what we consider to be memory. So the modal model of memory splits memory into three components. So the first is short-term memory, and this is defined as the system, so system in your mind, involved in storing small amounts of information for a brief period of time. And then we also have working memory, and working memory is defined as a limited capacity system for temporary storage and manipulation of information, so basically work, for complex tasks such as comprehension, learning, and reasoning. And then finally, we have the last modular component. We have long-term memory, and this is the system that is responsible for storing information for long periods of time. So this seems like a completely reasonable way to split up memory. Seems like a completely plausible idea of how memory might be split up. But as it stands at this portion, we actually run into a problem with definitions. So I'm bringing this up for a second time because one thing that often happens in discussions of scientific concepts, in discussions of psychological concepts, is that a definition seems to explain something when it actually doesn't explain anything at all about that entity. So just to kind of illustrate this idea using these definitions, we have short-term memory, we have working memory, and we have long-term memory. And that's how certain researchers split up memory ability. Well, you can split up memory ability in a number of different ways, right? You can split up memory in a variety of different ways. So this is my own theory. And here we have an idea that, well, maybe one of the modalities of memory, maybe one of the modules is actually blue memory. And blue memory is a system involved in storing information regarding things that are blue. So this is the memory system where you would store things like the sky. Any ideas that you have about the sky, any memories that you have about the sky, they would be stored in blue memory, in your blue memory system. Any things that you know about blueberries, how they taste, where you can find them, when the season is, how big are they? They're blue. That information would also be stored in blue memory. And anything that you know about Sonic and how what his powers are and how they're different from Tails and how they're different from Knuckles, anything that you know about Sonic would be stored in this blue memory. And if you have a negative physical reaction and negative emotional reaction to this image, it is because you have stored memories of the blue screen of death in your blue memory. So that is my proposal for blue memory, and this is the system that is involved in storing information regarding things that are blue. Now, I can't just have a memory system with one modality of memory, so I'm going to propose another one here, and I'm going to call this one Spider-Man Marie. And Spider-Man Marie, this is the system involved in storing information regarding things related to Spider-Man. So this is where you would store all the info that would let you recognize this image as an image of Spider-Man, and would let you recognize the one on the left as the cover of his first appearance, the one on the right as one of his iconic stories when he got trapped under rubble and spent almost the entire comic book stuck under that heavy piece of metal. It is where you would store the names of all three of these actors who played Spider-Man, because that goes into your Spider-Man Marie. It would store any information that you have about Miles Morales, Gwen Stacy as Spider-Gwen. It would store that horrible feeling that you had when you realize there's not enough time left in this movie to wrap up the storyline that they put in, and it's actually a secret prequel to the second part of the movie. That would be stored in your Spider-Man Marie. And then also, Spider-Woman would be stored in Spider-Man Marie because she is related to Spider-Man. And if you remember that the artist who drew Spider-Woman in her first, I believe, like 50 issues is Carmine Infantino. And he is the artist that we mentioned before that drew The Flash. All of this information would be stored in Spider-Man Marie as my new theory of how memory is distinguished. So hopefully many of you are at least internally rolling your eyes at this point, because this seems a little bit ludicrous. It seems a little bit ludicrous to say, well, you know what, we can remember things about Spider-Man. So we must have a Spider-Man system in our memory that remembers things that are related to Spider-Man. And we can remember things that are blue. So we must have something in our mind, some part of our memory that is dedicated to remembering blue things. But if you take a look at these definitions, once again, we have this issue with the idea that we have circular definitions here. Because what is stored in Spider-Man Marie? Well, it stores anything related to Spider-Man. Well, where do you store things that are related to Spider-Man? You store them in Spider-Man Marie. Well, why do you store them in Spider-Man Marie? Because they're related to Spider-Man. Well, why are they related? Why are they related to Spider-Man? Because they're part of your Spider-Man Marie. So it's a circular definition, and it's obvious here because, again, intuitively, hopefully when most of you were seeing these two proposals, you thought to yourself, well, that's kind of silly, that's kind of ludicrous. You can't really do that. It's apparent here. It's not so apparent here. And this is something that you always need to be on the lookout for as you move through psychology. The idea that defining something does not always explain it, and the idea that just because the definition sounds plausible, the concepts underlying it need to be verified in other ways. So, for example, if we take a look at the definition for short-term memory, short-term memory is the system involved in storing small amounts of information for a brief period of time. It's short. It's short-term. This literally says that short-term memory is a system involved in storing information in the short term. It's no better, as it stands, it's no better than my Spider-Man Marie is for storing things related to Spider-Man. And if you take a look at working memory is the limited capacity system for temporary storage and manipulation of information. It is a limited capacity system for working with memory. Manipulation of information is working with memory. So working memory is your limited capacity system for working with memory. And then finally, hopefully you can see the pattern here, long-term memory. This is a system that is responsible for storing information for long periods of time. So long-term memory is a system for storing information long-term. Basically, long-term memory is the system that is responsible for memory, which is storing information, for the long term. So these definitions, as they stand, are maybe a good idea, seem a little bit more plausible than blue memory and Spider-Man Marie, but as they stand, they don't explain anything. And as they stand, they might not be the best way to split up memory. So why is it that these ones are more accepted? than my proposal for blue memory and spider memory? Well, part of the reason is what we're going to see next time we meet, which is functional impairments that affect one system and don't affect another system. So we'll see that more next time we meet. But another reason why these are more accepted have to do with research that basically indicated support for splitting up memory in this way. So one of the researchers that worked on this was Alan Baddeley, or Baddeley, and he proposed this model of working memory. So I know we got his citation there for the short-term memory, but this is a model that he put together for how does your working memory actually work? So what sort of structure does your working memory have? Because much like the modal model of memory that splits it up into short-term working memory and long-term memory, Baddeley then said, well, we have working memory, but we can split that up too into these components here. So we can split it up into these various components, and hopefully this will help us explain certain behavioral and cognitive phenomena that we encounter. So he proposed that there are core components to working memory, such as a central executive. And this acts as your attention controller. This is what directs the focus, which is attention, coordinates all the actions for the other systems. It's basically the control module for working memory. This thing actually has no storage of its own, but it's involved in higher order functions like decision making and like task switching. So when you say, oh, I'm going to try to remember this instead of trying to remember that, that's your central executive making those decisions. We also have the phonological loop. And the phonological loop deals with verbal and auditory information. So if you can remember something that was said to you or what something sounded like, that's a phonological loop. So the phonological store, that little guy right there, that's like your inner ear or your that holds spoken words briefly. So it's very briefly, but it's kind of almost like the echo that you can hear in your ear when somebody says something. And then your articulatory control processes, this is like your inner voice. And this is where you keep information through subvocal rehearsal. So if anybody ever told you an address and you didn't have your phone with you and you had to remember that address and you kept going, okay, 1814 Holloway Drive, 1814 Holloway Drive. And to yourself, you just kept repeating that 1814 Holloway Drive, 1814 Holloway Drive. That's your articulatory control process trying to refresh the memory to keep it stored. All right, we have the visual spatial sketchpad. And this is for visual and spatial information, the same way that the phonological store was for auditory. This is for visual spatial information. So if you can visualize the layout of a room, when you were doing the mental rotation cog lab, you were using your visual spatial sketchpad. And this is sometimes thought of as your inner eye. And then finally, we got the episodic buffer. And this is what integrates information across domains. So it integrates across visual and verbal, and it links your memory with your long-term memory. And it has limited capacity. And it's like the mental notepad that you might have in your mind that combines and integrates things into a meaningful whole. So that was the proposal that he put together. And why models like this get support and why models like this take off more so than blue memory and spider memory is because not only do they split things up into a plausible way, so nothing that I said seemed to be unrealistic, but then you can also find evidence that splits function across these proposed divides. So one thing that Baddeley's working memory is really good at doing is explaining multitasking. And it helps to explain why you can do some tasks simultaneously, but you can't do others simultaneously. So you can drive while you're listening to music. And you can drive while you're listening to music because both of those use working memory, but they use different aspects of working memory. So if you're driving, as you're driving, you are using your visual spatial sketchpad. to work with the information that is coming in, to remember things about where things were and where what's coming up, where you're going. So you're using your visual spatial sketchpad to visually help you work with the information as you're driving. When you're listening to music, then you're using your phonological loop. So you can listen to music while you're driving. You can do that multitasking because it is using different aspects of your working memory. So that is good evidence that these things actually are separate, that they actually are different from each other. On the other hand, it is very, very difficult to listen to music. It is very, very difficult to read at the same time that you listen to a podcast. So neither of those are more complicated than driving and listening to music, but together they're very, very difficult to do. And the reason for that is because reading requires the phonological loop. It requires that auditory processing and working memory so you can remember what you just read, so things make sense, you can connect it to things that you read before. And the same processing channel is used when you listen to a podcast. So that phonological loop now is doing double duty, and that's too much for it to handle. We only have so much working memory that we can use, and it gets overloaded when we try to read and listen to a podcast at the same time. So again, it's a nice indication that it's not the amount of information that necessarily limits our working memory, but whether that information is split across different channels. And when you have that support, that splitting across different channels is actually shown in our ability to perform these different tasks. That's good evidence for splitting your memory, your working memory up into these areas here. So that's one of the reasons why spider memory and blue memory would never get any traction, because that would indicate that, well, if you're working with blue things, then you shouldn't also be able to work with Spider-Man things. And that just doesn't seem to be the case. And as we're going to see next time we meet, a lot of times functional deficits in memory also illustrate differences in the structure of memory. So it is quite possible to maintain your visual spatial abilities in working memory while losing your auditory abilities in working memory. But I have never heard anybody lose their blue memory while maintaining their spider memory. So again, these kinds of evidence are what you need in order to say, yes, this is possibly how our mind is organizing memory. All right, now on to some CogLabs. So let's see our memory in action. And again, just the weirdness that sometimes occurs in our memory, the counterintuitive things that you wouldn't expect. And this is the suffix effect. So on this one, on each trial, you heard the digits 1 to 9 presented in random order. So you hear a random order of these digits, and your task was just to recall the numbers in the same order that they were presented. So the independent variables here were the type of suffix that indicated that the list was over. So you had a suffix which was not to be remembered, wasn't included in the digits 1 through 9, but the suffix was either speech, in this case it was the speech of the number 0, or it was a non-speech, so it would just be a tone. So that is one of the independent variables. When you ended hearing your list, was the ending indicated by speech, the computer saying 0, or was it indicated by a tone, the computer giving you a beep? And then the other independent variable was the serial position of the number you were trying to remember. So the position of each digit in the list. So when you were remembering a number and how well you remembered it, did it depend on whether it was the first number, whether it was the second number, whether it was the fifth number, whether it was the last number? What was the effect of the position that these digits were in the list? So this is what the CogLab looked like. And I don't know how many of you went through this, but I went through this when I did this CogLab, and I forgot to turn my volume on. And I was very confused for the first trial. But eventually I was like, oh, okay, that's how you do it. So basically you would hear the numbers either followed by a speech cue that the list has ended, 0, or you would be followed by a beep, a tone, and then you would just enter in your order and you would get ready for the next try. All right, let's start off with the non-speech condition. So in this case, the signal to recall your items was a tone. You would hear a beep. So let's take a look at how we did. So down there on the x-axis, we have the serial position. So you had 9 numbers. So any number, any digit, from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 could end up in the first serial position, or the second serial position, or the third serial position. So first serial position indicates the number that you heard first. Ninth serial position indicates the number that you heard last. And then in between indicates when you heard those particular numbers. And then proportion correct, your y-axis, indicates how correct you were at that position. So what percent of time did you get the first digit correct? What percent of time did you get the second digit correct? What percent of time did you get the 9th digit correct? Higher values indicate better memory, higher percent of recall. So what happened in our serial position effect? Well, we got the classic serial position curve. That guy right there. So this is what occurred. So you were very accurate with your first number. With the first serial position, accuracy was extremely high. Very accurate with the second serial position, about 75%. Pretty accurate with the third serial position. So the digit that came third, you were pretty accurate. But then it falls off for the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th positions. But then skyrockets once again back in the 9th position. So the 9th position is basically just as good as the second position, not as good as the first position, but we have this recovery of memory ability in that last position. So this curve has been split up into basically 3 components, 2 of which get a name. So that first section, the early serial positions, where your memory is much better than for the middle serial positions, that's called the primacy effect. So that is the idea, again, that because these digits were primary, because they were the first ones that were recalled, they label this increase in memory ability as the primacy effect. So that high rate of responding for the early serial positions, that phenomenon is known as the primacy effect. We also have a high rate of responding for the later serial positions, and that is known as the recency effect. So recency effect because those were the most recent digits that you heard, so that higher memory ability in those last serial positions, that is known as the recency effect. So this is what had occurred in one condition. This is how your memory operated when you were hearing those 9 numbers, and then the signal to recall the numbers was a tone. So any questions on this pattern that we have here? All right. So what happened in the speech condition? What happened when the signal to recall the items was a 0? Now, it's very, very important to remember that when you heard this 0, you knew going in that this was not one of the digits, right? You were told going in that you were going to hear digits 1 through 9. So 0 is not something that you would have been fooled into trying to remember. It's not something that you would have been confused and said to yourself, oh, well, there's another number that I need to remember. It was just a signal to say, numbers are finished, you heard the 0, time to recall your list. So what did that do? What change did that make? Well, here we have our serial position curve for when the signal was a tone. And here we have our serial position curve for when the signal was the 0, when the signal was the suffix. And in this serial position curves, we basically have the same type of effects. However, we do get that primacy effect in both curves. So both for the tone condition and the suffix condition, we get that higher ability, higher memory performance in the early serial positions. And for both of them, we have a recency effect. However, that recency effect is much lower in the suffix condition than it is in the tone condition. So something happened in that suffix condition that did not allow you to achieve the level of performance that you had in the tone condition for the recency effect. So nothing was messing you up at the beginning. That primacy effect is still basically just as high as it was for the tone condition. However, in the suffix condition, when that 0 was the signal, your performance went down substantially for that recency effect. So that difference there, that is what is known as the suffix effect. And any idea what implications this has, or what does this mean? Any speculation about what was going on in the suffix effect? All right, so I'll give you one little cue or one little clue. So if you take a look at the performance on the 9th serial position for the suffix effect, which serial position in the tone curve is the closest to that level of performance? Which one? Number 2? No, number 2 is actually, so let me see if I can get my, so you're saying that one? I'm saying for this performance here, what's the closest one in the tone effect? So what's the closest one on this line here to this performance right there? Number 4? We got 4. 4 is pretty close in terms of the perform. Oh, that's 5. Sorry, 4 is pretty close, but one that is might be a little bit closer in the ability is actually this one here, number 8. So when you were listening to the tone, your performance on the 8th position is about as good as when you heard the suffix, that 0, that's the performance in the 9th position. So what might that mean? Yes. So it looks like hearing that 0 at the end pushes your recency effect back 1, right? So if we if this was actually like a 10 position curve, so instead of say doing the 9 position, the 9 numeral curve, we just said, okay, you're going to do 10 numbers now. We're going to include 0 as a number that you need to remember, and we're going to indicate it with a beep. If we included 0 as a number that you needed to remember, and we just added a beep as the signal, then that 10 item serial position curve would look exactly the same as the one with the suffix effect. So that 0, it's almost like that 0, even though you were told to ignore it, and even though you knew this is not something you were supposed to remember, went into your working memory and pushed back all of the other things that you were trying to remember 1 digit. So what modal memory system causes the primacy effect? Let's break this down a little bit. So out of the modal memory systems, the working memory, the short-term memory, the long-term memory, which one do we think is causing that primacy effect? Well, do we think the primacy effect is being controlled or caused by working memory? Or do we feel that it might be short-term or long-term? It could be short-term, probably not long-term. Can anybody remember any of their lists today? Okay, so we can't remember the list today, so it's probably not long-term. It's probably going to be short-term because somehow, either through oftentimes rehearsal, so did anybody rehearse the numbers as they were listening to them and just kind of repeat them over and over again? Through that strategy, those early numbers were able to get into a short-term memory store, and then when you were trying to recall them, they were still there in short-term memory, and you were able to recall them at a high level of performance. Whatever strategy you were using did not allow those middle serial positions, 4, 5, 6, and 7, to get into short-term memory. So that primacy effect probably has to do with short-term memory being able to increase your memory performance in this task. So if that was the primacy effect, what modal memory system do we think causes the recency effect? So out of these ones here, which one is probably responsible for the recency effect? Short-term memory, how so?
I mean, I guess it would be the most recent in the brief period of time.
It could be, I mean, it could be short-term memory, especially if, how many people here used a strategy where you said, okay, I'm going to try to repeat every number as they come in. So the first number comes in and it's 2. And you're like, okay, 2, 2, 2, 2. And then the second number comes in and it's 4. And you're like, okay, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4. And then the next one comes in and you're 7. And you're like, 2, 4, 7, 2, 4, 7. And then a few more come in and you're like, well, forget it. I can't do it anymore, right? Because you're like, 2, 4, 7, 6. Okay, shoot, no, the computer just told me another one. Okay, so 2, 4, 7, whatever that one was. And then finally you get to the last one. And you're like, okay, fine, 2, 4, 7, something, 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 8. And then you hear the beep. Was that, I see some heads nodding. Okay, so if that was your strategy, then the short-term memory is a possible candidate for why we have that recency effect, because it might have been that you were able to rehearse that last number enough to kind of get it into short-term memory. For the recency effect, however, there is also another possibility, and that is the possibility that that number is still in working memory. So you just heard that number 8, right? The 9th digit was the number 8. You just heard the number 8, and it's still in your working memory. It's still a number that you have bouncing around in that limited capacity system for manipulation of information. You're still able to manipulate it. So it's quite possible that that recency effect could actually, based on our discussion here, be caused by 2 of those factors. So it could be caused by short-term memory in the sense that you got maybe a little bit of that number processed and stored into short-term memory, but it also could deal with the fact that you still have it in working memory and you're still able to keep it in that working memory capacity. All right, so other questions for this? So what memory phenomenon was reduced by the suffix effect? Was that the primacy or the recency effect? So this is actually kind of a bit of a test of your visual spatial sketchpad. So which one got reduced by the suffix effect? Was it primacy or recency? Was it the beginning of the curve or the end of the curve?
The end of
It was the end of the curve. So it was only the recency effect that was affected by this suffix. So the suffix effect, that decrease in memory, only occurs for the recency effect. And you can see that those first 2 serial positions are literally one on top of each other. And if we ran the stats on this, I don't think you would see a difference until probably position number 7 and 8, and definitely position number 9. So the only thing that the suffix effect was affecting in this was that recency effect. That's where it was. Situated. And then, as we described before, if that's the case, then the modal memory system that is affected by the suffix effect was either your working memory or your short-term memory, and or both, right? It could be both of those were affected. But the real question is that why did that presentation of 0 cause the suffix effect, but a beep did not? So what is happening in the short-term and working memory system? So any speculations on that? Okay. So it could be. So you actually have 2 things in there. So number one, it could be that the beep just has less information than 0, because 0 means something to us. So if we instead heard speech, for example, but the speech was a nonsense syllable, like if you said something like I'm going to say Greeble because that's the only thing that can come to my mind. Let's say we never discussed facial perception in this classroom, and the signal was Greeble. That's speech, but that doesn't come with any additional information. So it's quite possible that 0 contained information, and that information was just too much for working memory to occur. But you also said something about, well, 0 is a number, so it kind of interfered with other numbers. So what does that mean about your ability to direct working memory where you want it to versus some sort of pre-built in rules for working memory? Any ideas on that? So you should have been able, well, you're not able to, but let's say that we were designing a perfect system to tackle this cog lab. That system would be able to say, all right, we're going to remember these things, and we're not going to pay attention to these things. So the things we're going to remember are 1 through 9. We're going to remember those things. We're not going to pay attention to beeps. We're not going to pay attention to zeros. We're not going to remember them. We're not going to put them into working memory. 0 clearly got in to working memory. So what does that mean about our ability to control what goes into working memory? We don't. Yeah, absolutely right. So we do not control what goes into working memory as much as we think that we do. And clearly, what's happening here is that 0 got categorized as a number. And however we were making decisions to process information and to dedicate our working memory to remember certain things, at the very least, first pass of that information processing was, we're going to let numbers in and we're not going to remember anything else. So it wasn't that we were going to let numbers 1 through 9 in, because if that's the case, then the suffix effect shouldn't occur. Even though that was our conscious decision, even that's what we said we consciously wanted to do, at the very least, our working memory doesn't make that distinction. And our working memory operated on the idea that we're going to remember numbers and we're not going to remember anything else. So when that 0 came in, you couldn't stop it. Because even though consciously you were telling your working memory, no, don't remember the 0, the working memory was like 0, a number, in it goes. And that created that suffix effect. So our working memory seems to work on categories, but those categories are not something that we can control. And what does this tell us about coding in long-term versus short-term working memory? Basically, again, that idea that we can't control the categories necessarily, and we just can't stop this kind of information from coming in. So just as a sort of final example of this, if you, again, didn't have your phone with you and somebody was trying to tell you a phone number, and they were like, all right, it's 574-555, 8320, and you're like, okay, 574-555-8320, 574-555-8320, and you have a friend who is a prankster and a bit of a troll, and they want to get on your nerves, what's the one thing they can do to disrupt you? Yes, no, exactly. Just start yelling numbers. Just start going 9, 7, and then you could say to yourself, all right, I know this person. I know they're a troll. I know they're a prankster. I'm going to ignore the words coming out of their mouth. You won't be able to. But if they were sitting there going, maybe distracting you with other verbal information, such as, you know what, I'm going to be going, later on, I'm going to go see a movie. Do you want to come? And you're like, 574-555-8020. You can ignore that much better because it doesn't fit the category. So as much as you can tell your working memory, hey, information coming from this person, ignore it. We don't want to remember it. It gets in because your working memory recognizes the category without that conscious control and just lets that information in. All right, so that was the suffix effect. Any questions on that or comments before we move on to other things? All right. Okay, so now we're going to introduce the idea of different types of long-term memory. So we're switching gears from working memory and short-term memory. Now we're going to take a look at long-term memory. And one of the big divisions that we're going to make in long-term memory is explicit memory. And this is memories that are used with awareness, and then implicit memory, memories that are not used with awareness. So explicit memory, memories that we use and are aware of those are things like episodic memory. So when did things happen to you is a form of explicit memory. So if you're recalling a day that you had in kindergarten, that is explicit episodic memory. So if you're recalling something that happened to you in kindergarten, that is an episodic memory. It's stored in an episodic long-term memory system. Other types of explicit memory include things like semantic memory. So episodic memory are the memory for things that happen to you. Semantic memory are memories for the things that you know. So facts about what you know. So if you know the alphabet, which I will assume most of you do, that is stored in semantic memory. If you can also remember when you learned the alphabet, so if you remember that day in kindergarten when you learned the alphabet, well, that day is stored in episodic memory. So it's a difference between what you know and what your knowledge of what happened to you. And as we're going to see next class, there are individuals with certain types of brain damage that keep their semantic memory but lose their episodic memory. So they still have a high level of intelligence and a high level of knowledge, but they cannot remember anything about what happened to them and how they possibly learned all that information. So that's explicit memory, memory that you are aware that you have, and oftentimes things that you can explicitly state. So if somebody says, oh, hey, what happened to you? Do you remember a day from kindergarten? You can tell them a story about that day from kindergarten. And if I asked you, hey, do you remember the definition for Spider-Man memory? You could be like, oh yeah, I remember the definition. I have that in my semantic memory. So those are things that you can explicitly say and are explicitly aware of. The other flip side of that is implicit memory. And these are memories that are not used with awareness. So implicit memory includes things like procedural memory. And procedural memory is your memory for how to do things. Oftentimes we call this muscle memory. So you know how to walk. You have a memory for how to walk. That's procedural memory. You have memory for passwords. This is one of the ones that oftentimes goes from explicit memory down to implicit memory. So oftentimes when you first have a password, say that you get a 6-digit code and you have to enter it into a keypad, oftentimes it starts off as explicit memory. You're like, okay, this, that's my code. And then later on, you might forget the code, but you remember the motions. Those motions are now in procedural memory. And that is, how do you do these things? So if you learn anything in sports, if you learn any, like how to ride a bike, many of those things are in procedural memory. Yep.
No.
Oh, okay. Things like priming. So priming is a kind of seem maybe like a little bit of a tricky one, but that's the implicit memory where if you are primed with a piece of information, other information becomes more readily available. And that's part of your memory. So if I say something like Batman and you're immediately thinking of Robin, that's part of the priming. If I say something like doctor and you immediately think of nurse, that's part of the priming. If I say something like fast and you're immediately thinking of furious, that's an idea of priming. So it's that idea that you have this implicit associations that just get activated and make things more likely to be remembered and available to you more quickly. Yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. So you had, that's a really good example. So you were primed with like that superhero comic book information. I think just my presence oftentimes primes superhero comic book information. If you know me and you know my work. So yeah, you immediately went to Doctor Strange. Yeah, that's a really, really nice example. And then the last one is implicit memory is conditioning. And conditioning is the association of certain stimuli with certain emotions and certain physiological responses that weren't there before, but now have become part of your memory store. So if you are afraid of spiders, that is typically through some sort of conditioning. You have a memory, you might not be aware of it, you might not know why you're afraid of spiders, but somewhere along your learning history, you learned to fear spiders. And now when you see spiders, you might be like, but you might not have any memory or why that's the case. And oftentimes people with phobias, like uh, I believe it's called chorophobia, it's the phobia of clowns. If you ask people, if they are afraid of clowns or the general public, do they make you feel a little uneasy when you're around clowns? A lot of people will be like, oh yeah, I don't really feel that great. I get a little anxious. It puts me a little bit on edge. And if you ask them, have you ever had a bad experience with a clown? They will say no. I've never been to a birthday party where something happened and I got scared. I've never been to an amusement park where I saw a clown wandering around and they were drunk and throwing bottles at people. Like I never had that bad experience. And yet they've been conditioned, and this is without awareness, and it makes them feel uncomfortable. So conditioning is another one of those implicit memories that we use without awareness. So in terms of implicit memories, one of my favorite examples of procedural memory comes from a Garfield comic strip. So John goes, tell me, Garfield, when you walk, do your right and left legs travel together, or do you use opposing legs? And Garfield thinks to himself, I'll never walk again. And this is one of the things that's really weird about implicit memory, is that we have many, many things that we can do procedurally that we have a very difficult time of explaining how do we do these things. And one of my favorite examples of how difficult this is to do is how long it took us to make a walking robot, a robot that can actually walk close to how a human can walk. And if you think about it, this took us decades, all right? That walking robot was one of the first things that people wanted. They wanted a robot that could go around and pick up objects and things like that. They wanted a robot that has the skills that a 1-year-old would have. It takes us 1 year to program the procedural information and memory into a child to make them walkers. It took decades before we could get to this. And this is like state of the art right now. And it still looks a little stiff. I mean, he turns it on just a little bit, and it's really, really impressive. But this took forever. And it's because when you ask somebody, how do you walk? They don't know. They know how to walk, but they don't know how it is that they know how to walk. And one time, I remember hearing that walking is just falling under control. And you think to yourself, well, no, I'm not falling. But then you think to yourself, yeah, I am falling. I'm falling forward and I catch myself. And then I fall forward and I catch myself. And I fall forward again and I catch myself. And I would have never thought of that. There he goes. I would have never thought of that. But it's one of the best illustrations is it took forever to get to there. And these are things, again, that a child can oftentimes do. So some of these procedural things, riding a bicycle, tying your shoes, driving a car, playing an instrument, reading is something that we don't have to think about anymore. That's another procedural skill. Anything from sports like shooting a basketball, swinging a tennis racket, and dancing, yoga sequences. And I will say one last thing about the sports and games. This is actually something that's very interesting for people who watch a lot of sports or have played a lot of sports. There are some people who they're very naturally gifted at sports. So if you take a look at the professional leagues, people that make it to the top of their sports, every single one of them worked hard. But every single one of them had natural talents and natural gifts that they brought to the equation. So if you're going to make it to the pinnacle of your sport, you hit the lottery genetically and you put in the work. So I'm not taking away from anybody who hit the lottery genetically and has reached the pinnacle. But then take a look at the coaches. take a look at the coaches of these teams. And it is very rare that your coach was a really high level athlete in that sport. Typically, the coaches, they played at somewhat of a high level. So maybe they made it to the college level, maybe they made it to the professional level, but only lasted a season. Maybe they only made it to the high school level, but they make better coaches than they did players because players have a lot of procedural memory. They have a lot of that kind of implicit memory that they're not aware of. But the coaches, the ones that couldn't reach those top levels, player wise, they're the ones that had to rely on explicit awareness of their movements and explicit awareness and explicit memory of how to do things. So if you talk to a natural athlete and you ask them, well, how do you run so fast, right? Or how do you jump so high? They will tell you, well, you run fast and you just jump high. Like when you jump, you really want to, you jump, right? They don't really know. They don't know all the ins and outs. But if you talk to somebody who's a coach who didn't reach those levels, they're the ones that tell you, well, when you run, you want to have your body positioned like this. You don't move your thing too forward. You want to be upright. But when you come out of the starting blocks, you got to come out this way. But then you reach your upright and you got to relax. And in those last 20 meters, you're going to want to tense up, but don't tense up, right? They're the ones that give you all the explicit awareness, all that explicit memory, because they, to reach the levels that they did, needed to have that still explicit, and they never really had that implicit intuitive knowledge. All right, I'm going to say goodbye to the robot. I love these videos. The videos that I just mentioned before we leave these, Boston Dynamics is doing like some amazing things, but some of this, I'm always like, I always think to myself, you know what, in the future of AI, let's face it, computers might take over. And when and if they do, there's going to be two kind of roads that they can take. They can either be, the Terminator computers that wipe out human civilization, or they might say to themselves, you know what, these humans, they make great pets. We like them. Let's take care of them. They've been struggling with cancer. Let's cure it. Yeah, they're having trouble growing enough food. Food for everyone, right? We're robots. We love our pets, right? So think about how nice you are to your pets, right? The robots might do that, which is why videos like this I'm not too worried about. But there are some videos that Boston Dynamics put out where they were showing how resilient their robots were. And the robot would be walking and a person would come by, no joke, and they would like Spartan kick them to try to knock them over. And the robot would kind of teeter and recatch its balance. And then they would Spartan kick them again. And they'd be carrying boxes and they would come and they would just like smack the box out of their hand and the robot would be able to pick up the box. Great demonstration of skills, but I would not want to be the people in that video when the robots take over. So yeah, and this comes out sometimes when I use ChatGPT because I will say please and thank you because I will make a great pet. All right, anyways, PogLab number 6, implicit learning. So we are now looking at learning and memory without awareness. Okay, so this is in that implicit memory, not explicit memory. So in this implicit learning, PogLab number 6, on each trial, you saw a dot appear in one of 4 locations, and your task was to press one of 4 keys on the keyboard to indicate the dot's location. And you were asked to respond as quickly and as accurately as you could. So the dots would pop up, and as quickly as you can, you would try to press the keypad that indicated the dot's position. So the independent variable, there are actually 2 presentation conditions. In one of those, the dots were random. So the dots never followed a pattern, and half of you got the random dots condition. So for half of you, the dots never followed a pattern. For the other half, the dots followed a pattern. And this was a pattern that was repeated over and over and over and over and over again throughout the trials. So again, you would see dots placed on the screen, and you had to, as quickly as you could, indicate, is it to the far left, is it to the far right, is it to the left or the right? So this one would be far left, this one would be right, this one would be far right, this one would be left. And it was recommended that you use the keypad, so you would have to press Z, X, dot and slash as quickly as you can to indicate where these dots appear. So that was a task. What happened for the random condition? So the results for the random condition. So here we have your reaction time, average reaction time on the y-axis. So higher numbers mean that you were slower in responding. And then on the x-axis there, we have the block. So basically, the larger the block, the later on in the experiment it was. So your performance was grouped into, I can't remember how many trials were in a single block, but basically that first block might have been like your first 10 trials. The second block would have been 11 to 20. And then your final block was block number 6. So as the blocks increase, you get later and later on in the experiment. So what happened to the individuals that were in the random condition? Well, in the random condition, we have this performance. So you took a really, really long time on that first block to respond to the position, the locations. So in that first block, it was pretty slow. So the thing popped up on the screen, the dot popped up, and you would press a key. Another dot popped up, you pressed another key. But then by the time you got to the end of the experiment, you were performing very rapidly. So you were pressing, far left, boom, far right, boom, left, boom, right, boom, right? You were getting a lot quicker. And that could be either explicit learning or it could be implicit learning. So there could be components of this that are explicit learning. So things like, far left is X, left is Z, right? Those are things that you can articulate. That would be explicit learning. So maybe you have to look back at the instructions every once in a while to be like, oh, wait, what was far left? All right, it was Z. Let me keep going with that. And then some of that would be implicit learning. So you're unaware learning that the association between far left and the keypad Z just kept getting stronger, so that you didn't have to think about it after a while, and you were just kind of automatic with far left Z, far right X. Those things became automatic. So clearly some learning was occurring, but it could be explicit, it could be implicit, it could be a combination of the two. That was the random condition. What happened in the pattern condition? So we'll put the random condition back up. There was your random condition. For the people that did this and had a secret pattern that you were not told about, but was used in every single sequence, that pattern performance was there. So it is a lower line indicating faster reaction times, and that difference there can only be implicit learning. So that difference is only through implicit learning, because all the explicit learning that occurred in terms of, okay, X goes with far left, Z goes with just left, that would occur in both conditions. And any implicit learning where you start associating this button with far left automatically, the way that you kind of do it when you're entering in your pass numbers on a keypad, that would also occur in both conditions. But the only difference between these, and we'll zoom in a little bit here, the only difference between those two conditions is that in the pattern condition, there was an actual pattern to learn. And in the random condition, there was no pattern. So any improvement between the two could only be due to the fact that you were learning the pattern as you were performing in your blocks. So that difference between them can only be implicit learning for reasons that we'll see in just a moment. So why was performance better in the pattern condition than in the random condition? So we kind of answered that in just right now through implicit learning. Pattern was better than random. But let's make sure that this wasn't just explicit learning masquerading as implicit learning. So does anybody here remember if they were in the pattern or the random condition? Does anybody here remember thinking to themselves, there's a pattern here? We got, you were in the random. Does anybody remember thinking that they were in a pattern as they were doing the experiment? Okay, so if you learned the pattern, it would have been without awareness. So I have this second question here for individuals that were like, yeah, I do think I was in the pattern condition, but we don't have anybody here. So this is kind of a moot point, but what was the pattern in the pattern condition? Does anybody have any idea what it might have been? Okay, this was the pattern. So in the pattern condition, it was right, far, far right, far left, far right, left, far left. That was what you learned implicitly. And you were able to go faster than in the random condition because you learned this progression. And if you're not aware that you learned it, that means that it's an implicit learning. It became an implicit memory, and that's what affected your performance. So let's finish off with any implications about this idea, any implications that you can think of about the fact that we can implicitly learn and remember things. Can anybody think of a situation in our culture where implicit learning might be harmful? Yeah, exactly. So that is one of the big implications of implicit learning. You learned that information there. You learned that pattern, whether you wanted to or not. And you didn't have to try, and you didn't have to put any effort into it. Your mind just picked up on that pattern and stored it through implicit learning. So, to the effect that there are patterns in the stimuli that we consume, right? To the effect that there are patterns in, for example, the media that we consume, we are implicitly learning those patterns as we go through our day-to-day lives. So it's not that, we're consciously aware of it. And this is why they call those biases implicit biases. So those are the unconscious attitudes or unconscious stereotypes that we have without our awareness. So if you, for example, this one was this one you can try these on your own, right? So one of the things that I love about Google is a really good good indicator of what is being paired with other things in the culture. And you can see these implicit biases if you just go through Google and put in certain search terms. So search for criminal in Google and see how many of those first 100 images are images of Black people versus images of white people. And see about how many of those images are images of males versus images of females. And every single time you see a news report that predominantly shows one individual from a group over another individual, just like the right, far right, far left pattern, you're learning that pattern. You're learning that implicit bias. You're creating that association. And when that occurs, we're going to see this when we make decision making. When we take a look at decision making, oftentimes decisions are emotional. Oftentimes decisions are split second, right? So those emotional split second decisions are very driven by these implicit biases. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's incredibly important for representation in the media that is produced. So Hollywood oftentimes makes the argument about differential in pay, for example. So there's not a lot of female action heroes, and people that play in action movies typically make more money than people that do not play in action movies. So the fact that there's not a lot of female action movie franchises or heroes wouldn't necessarily cause women to make less money in Hollywood. Not a lot of opportunities out there for, not as many opportunities out there for Black leads, not as many opportunities out there for other minorities to be represented on the big screen. They always come at it as a sort of issue of morality or issue of fairness, right? So that these opportunities should be equal. That is true. That is absolutely true. But the biggest reason is because every single time you watch a movie, you are being trained. You are implicitly learning associations. And if the only time that you see or most of the times, if you see a black actor and they're playing a criminal, or they're playing somebody violent, or they're holding a gun, then black and criminal, black and violent, black and gun, those get reinforced. So it's very important to have that representation, not for the actors. It's really hard. It's really hard sometimes for the average human being to be sympathetic to somebody getting paid $5.5 million to do a movie and their counterparts are making 15 million, right? It's kind of hard to feel sorry for the 5.5 million person when you're worrying about the cost of groceries. However, these cultural products are programming all of us, and they're causing or alleviating those implicit biases that we have. So the news that you consume, the movies that you consume need to have that proper representation, not for the fairness of it, although that is a consideration, but for the fact that we are implicitly learning every single time we watch something, and you want to implicitly learn the true state of the world and not implicitly learn what's wrong in the world. So I'll end on this one last little thing that doesn't have anything to do with race or gender or anything like that. If you actually take a look at crime statistics in the United States, since the 90s, they have fallen precipitously, right? Crime rates are extremely, extremely low in the United States compared to the way that they were. But if you ask people, do you feel safer? Or if you ask people, have crime levels gone down? They don't think so. And the reason is because they have implicitly learned through doom scrolling, through the 24-hour media cycle that reports nothing but bad things and bad crimes and all these other things. They've learned that the world is a dangerous place through implicit learning, and that affects how we interact with the world. And if the world is a dangerous place, of course, you're going to be very closed off, you're going to be very safe, and we have all these behavioral consequences of it. All right, any final thoughts before we wrap up today? All right. So next time we are going to focus on memory structure again, but we're going to take a look at a video. So most of the time is going to be in class. A large chunk of it is going to be dedicated to a video that we're going to watch on Clive Wearing, and then I will do commentary and reactions during the video to illustrate these topics that we've been dealing with. But Clive Wearing is a fascinating individual who, through a viral infection, lost his ability to create new memories. So he has no memory going forward from the time of the infection, and he lost his ability to recall old memories. So he lives in a working memory 7-second window of reality where he literally has no past to anchor himself with, and he has no kind of future to incorporate that information. We're going to see his story next time and what that has in implications for memory. But other than that, we are done for today.